This presentation will not really offer any technical advice or any specific solutions to the problems that we face at our jobs. Instead, it's a broader look at the work that we do. My perspective is probably not terribly unique. Like many of you, I spent years working as a photographer in a museum, but now I work at an auction house. I currently head up the photo department at Bonham's Auction House in New York City. Today, I want us to examine the process of photographing fine art and cultural heritage items in a nonprofit institution and how that overlaps with working with the same types of objects in a more commercial environment. It's not my intention to spend the next half an hour telling you things you already know, but rather I've been asked to speak today with the goal of continuing this ongoing discussion and address some of the questions and ideas that we all have throughout our work. So half of these items were shot in a museum, and the other half were shot for sale in an auction catalog. There's a great many similarities between the subject matter here: paintings, sculptures, artifacts. However, the difference is the purpose of photographing these objects. The items photographed at a nonprofit like museums and commercial institutions like an auction house overlap a lot, but the main difference is the purpose of the photography. So the questions that we're going to look at today are: how does purpose affect our work? How does money affect our work? And what is the value of what we do? The purpose of a museum is, for the most part, pretty clear. They collect, preserve, display objects of cultural, scientific significance for the study and education of the public. Generally speaking, the purpose of an auction house is to attract a wide audience of buyers and sellers and achieve the best results for their property. So if we're both routinely shooting fine art and culturally historic relevant objects, then what's the difference? The difference is the purpose and the priorities. The reality is that purpose establishes distinct priorities. Although the images, assuming they're equal in quality, seem to be indistinguishable, the destination and the lifespan of the images are disparate. Priorities for a museum and a nonprofit are likely, first and foremost, accuracy and authenticity. The standards established through FADGI and Metamorphose offer object analysis and rate the quality of most of the collection photography that we have all been involved with. I think the Smithsonian wonderfully articulates the broad purpose of collection photography in their mission on their digitization programs. So through digitization, the Smithsonian seeks to broaden access to its treasures, safeguard them for future generations, speed research, add meaning, encourage collaboration, and integrate its holding across museums and programs, and on platforms where audiences engage with us. The most obvious purpose of collection photography is that it allows access to previously unseen objects. My understanding is that on average, museums only are able to display between 2 and 4% of their whole collection, sometimes even less. The paleontology department at the American Museum of Natural History has 0.02% of their collections on display. That leaves another 99.98% of the collection behind closed doors. Students, educators, researchers rely on collection photography for access. It's not a criticism of their museum, but just evidence of how vital digitization work is. The work that collection photographers do is also opens up the museum to a wider audience. Of course, collection photography is also used during conservation. Conservation photography is a huge topic that I can't begin to unpack, but needless to say, it's a critical tool for museums. Preservation. So There's two parts to the preservation idea. Providing access to objects is a form of preservation. Anyone who's ever shot a medieval manuscript or unfolded a letter from the 18th century will understand the fragility of such items. If researchers can access high quality images of these items, then it means that the objects can stay in a safe, controlled environment where they don't need to be handled and possibly damaged. The other aspect of preservation is the creation of a digital surrogate. Sometimes things happen to museums and things get destroyed. During World War II, for example, a lot of museums in Europe sustained damage and collection items were lost. In the wake of 9/11, there were serious concerns about the safety of collections that were stored in Manhattan. Nearly 1 million artifacts spanning 4 centuries of New York City history were stored at the World Trade Center. Artifacts recovered from the notorious Five Points neighborhood, as well as a repository for 17th century African burial grounds, and the photo archives for the Port Authority. Just 3 collections that were destroyed when the North Tower collapsed. Other collections in Manhattan at the time acted in response. Around this time, I worked at the Museum of Natural History in the paleontology department as a collection photographer. The project I was shooting was a holotype skull specimens. The holotype is a single specimen that a researcher designates as a name-bearing representative for a new species. It's a really important tool for scientists. For example, the Oviraptor holotype is in their collection. That means that if anybody else finds an Oviraptor, it needs to be compared to the original specimen. It's important to keep the physical object safe and well documented. Well, the most immediate purpose of the images that was to make the specimens available for research, my images also served as documentation of the object in case it was destroyed in the future. Photography serves multiple purposes at an auction house as well. While we don't need to address conservation or preservation, we do need to deal with authentication. When fine arts are consigned and the objects arrive at the auction house, its first stop is always a photo studio. Paintings and sculptures need to be accompanied by certificates of authenticity in order to be sold, but they often get lost by previous owners. So the specialists need to get them reissued. This is a lengthy process, and it involves providing evidence of provenance, exhibitions, etc. The process begins though with photographing the work. The photographers work with the specialists to capture high-res images according to specifications by the Authentication Committee. These experts usually require large, unretouched file along with the color checker. At this point, accuracy is critical since our images are used to assess whether a painting or sculpture is real. Many of our clients who have purchased items from Bonhams do so without ever seeing the objects in person. Rather, their decisions are based solely on the photography that me and my team produce. Last year, we sold over 10,000 items in 80 different sales just in our New York office, each with multiple views for the catalog and website. Our images also support the work that the marketing department does. Obviously, the main purpose of photography that happens here at an auction house is to feature the items that we're trying to sell. Whether it's in a printed catalog or in an app, on our website, or social media, the goal is to sell. Color accuracy is critical for photography in an auction house, not only for the authentication process, but also for the buying and selling process. Consigners need to feel confident that their property is being represented in the most authentic way possible, and buyers need to trust that what they see is what they're going to get. Both museums and auction houses face the same frustrating issues when it comes to sharing images online. Since our images appear different depending on your browser, your operating system, especially by your device, it's nearly impossible to control the end product. So how does money affect our work? It's been my experience, whether at a nonprofit such as a museum or a for-profit such as an auction house, that money plays a big role in what gets shot and how. Museums fund their digitization programs in several different ways. In my experience, whether I was at a small institution or a large one, I was always on a staff position that was partially, if not completely, supported by grant funds. There are, of course, museums that don't rely on grants that are able to support their own imaging department. And from what I understand, those projects run differently. From talking to peers who work at internally funded imaging departments, collection photography at these institutions is often exhibition-based or curatorially focused. Digitization projects are used to support upcoming publications and research projects and exhibitions. More and more, small to mid-sized museums are including digitization into their budgets, but many still rely on grant funding to run their photo studios. The grants I worked on were generally from large government-funded institutions. When substantial portions of the operating budget are tied to grants, it becomes complicated when national politics impacts federally funded cultural institutions. Most recently, the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts. It can and it has jeopardized programs, digitization programs in the recent past. Relying on grants can cause instability in imaging departments, which can affect turnover and overall quality. This is an issue where commercial motivation provides stability and sustainability. Despite pandemics and global conflicts and volatility in the stock market, people are still interested in spending money at auctions. For example, during a time when a large number of nonprofits were shrinking, our sales were having great success. During 2020, our auction house switched from in-person sales to hybrid sales, which were live events that were streamed online with phone, app, and online bidding taking place. The move became dependent solely on online and hybrid sales, and it put an higher importance on the photography. Money dictates the amount of time and attention that our photographers in an auction house invest in a piece of property. Generally, higher value items get more time in the photo studio. The value of property dictates the time that the photographers can spend shooting it. We are faced with a very high volume of property that needs to get shot. And so we need to consider our estimates when prioritizing objects in the studio. Property with high estimates gets more real estate in the catalog and is often featured on covers and marketing material. Museums must also make decisions about allotting time and focus on specific objects, but this can be more subjective since collection items don't come with price tags. Cultural and historical value are up for debate, and depending on the institutions and their curators, the granting bodies, and the that are funding the imaging projects, it's a more subjective process. When considering the role that money plays in our work, it leads to the question of what is the value of what we do. A few months after I graduated from college, I attended a gallery opening for a fellow alumni's photo exhibit. I was chatting with an old professor who was also there. He inquired what I'd been up to since graduating. I told him I landed a job as a collections photographer at a museum. Before I could explain how much I loved it and how exciting it was, he patted me on the shoulder and said, "Well, at least it's a paycheck." It was clear that he did not see the value in what I was doing. I suppose he felt I needed consolation because I had accepted a photography job that was not about self-expression or creating art. To him, it was a very technical job and I was doing to pay the rent, but the truth was, and still is, it's one of the coolest jobs I ever had. I got to set up my very own studio at the Museum of Natural History, deep within collection storage. And I got to handle and photograph fossils every day. I befriended paleontologists. I went on digs. As a kid who grew up in New York, I lived for that museum. So for 22-year-old me, working there as a photographer, no less, was literally a dream come true. I could work alone in a photo studio, but still be part of a larger team. And my work was valued and appreciated, and it was being used to support research. I found a niche and I thrived in it. During the pandemic, I transitioned from working in a museum to working in an auction house. A friend, a fellow collections photographer, kindly gave me a glowing recommendation for a wonderful job opportunity at a museum last year. They assumed that I'd be excited at the chance to come back to nonprofit. It seemed in their estimation that commercial work held less value. Much like my professor assumed that collections photography held less value than making art, some of my colleagues in the museum world considered commercial work, that it held less value than collections photography, even if we were shooting the same objects. So we've unpacked the purpose of our work, but what is the value? What does it achieve? What does it change? While working in museums, I had the privilege of being part of projects that are really interesting and useful to the institutions, but I have also been involved in projects that would be considered very niche and a bit obscure. In 2018-19, the NEH awarded the Museum of the City of New York a grant to digitize 35,000 manuscripts that belonged to composer and playwright George M. Cohan. I worked at a copy stand for a year and a half. I shot sheet music and manuscripts for 18 months with very few interruptions. And I'm going to be honest, and I hope I don't offend, but I do not love musicals. I always try to engage with the material that I'm shooting, and I try to understand it, connect with it, and learn something while I'm working. But this project, I really struggled. And as I was shooting, I would space out. And I would wonder, would anyone even look at any of the photos that I shot? It's been my experience that working on projects such as this can cause like an existential crisis. Intellectually, I know that these objects are in a museum and they have cultural value, and photographing them broadens accessibility and allows the museum to preserve these pieces better. And while some of the more obscure collections that I have the pleasure of digitizing will only ever be seen by the digital asset manager, it's nice to know that they're serving a purpose. They are helping preserve collections and allow access on a large scale. That being said, it can be disheartening, to know that much of your work that you put into such a large project will never really prove much value to anyone. The photographs I take in my current job don't run the risk of not being viewed. Our images are a critical piece of our business. As I mentioned earlier, many of our clients who purchase items from Bonhams do so without ever even seeing the object in person. They just go off our photographs. Our images feature on websites, apps, advertising, marketing campaigns, and they sometimes get picked up by media outlets as well. Additionally, as opposed to the monotonous nature of collections photography projects that I've been involved with, working at an auction house is often an opportunity to engage with a wide variety of objects. The things I get to shoot in a more commercial space are very varied and keeps things more interesting. In the past month, I shot Impressionist paintings, oceanic Aboriginal art, and all sorts of things. While there's an increase in the visibility of our photography, there's also a shelf life. In the case of fine art, such as a painting sale, our job is to produce a catalog that's perfectly accurate and shows reproductions of the works. A lot of effort goes into getting the catalog to match the paintings. However, once the sale is done, the catalog is done. A copy goes into our library and people forget about it. There's few exceptions to this, but more often than not, our photography has a shelf life of about 6 to 8 weeks. Our images serve their purpose leading up to the sale, and once it's over, our photographs are no longer needed. Surely, two of photography's benefits are its capacity to visualize and capture an image for the world to see, and its ability to immortalize something that otherwise would be lost to us, particularly in a digital world. So my question is then, what's worse? To be taking photos that no one is likely to see, or to be taking photos that no one is likely to keep? I don't have an answer for this. So a collections photographer at a museum and a photographer at an auction house start out with very different purposes. At the end process, their images serve very different functions and have very different lifespans. But for one moment in the middle, there is a time where the job is basically the same. And this is a really good opportunity for collaboration. One of the most important things that I learned as a photographer at a museum was how critical it was to be part of a professional community. I don't know about many of you, but my role as a photographer in a collection space was relatively solitary. I'd work in a quiet studio, in an isolated space. I would meet with the director of collections once a month, and sometimes the only person I'd see in a day would be the janitor. Being part of a community like this one is helpful since we can tap into the wealth of knowledge in our field. At the end of last year, Bonhams consigned 150 animation cells that needed to be shot quickly for an upcoming sale. I have never shot animation cells before. And for those of you unfamiliar, they are shiny pieces of acetate with hand-painted illustrations. Most of the ones I had to shoot had multiple layers as well as backgrounds. And some were bumpy, so there were condition issues that caused specular highlights. There's always a delicate balance between showing an object in its true condition and trying to make it look as good as possible. It's a line that we both must navigate in museums as well as auction houses, how to make something beautiful while maintaining its authenticity. The property was being shipped internationally, and it was due to arrive close to the cataloging deadline. It got stuck in customs and the deadline kept getting closer, but the property had still not arrived. I knew I was running out of time and that I had very little time to figure out the best way to set up my studio. But I also know that I was not the first person in the world who ever had to shoot animation cells. I reached out to Matt Fretchel who's the senior photographer at the Animation Research Library at Disney. And within a few hours, he wrote me back with details of his studio setup, lighting suggestions, and helpful pointers for reducing the specular highlights that I was concerned about. Thanks to his help, we were able to meet some pretty impossible deadlines. Even though I no longer work at a museum, I'm still photographing fine art and cultural heritage items, and I still find it helpful to reach out to peers with questions. People in this room know that I am not shy with questions. I also have a team of photographers working with me at my office who have only ever had commercial jobs, and I've learned from them and their approach to photography, and I feel I have a responsibility to share my experiences as well. In order to broaden our approach to work, we are now looking outward. In the next few months, I've scheduled tours of museum studios. I love visiting other people's workspace, seeing what challenges they face and how they solve their problems. It's a great way to expand and to grow. We're all going to move on to a time of questions after this. And I'd love to hear your feedback and any ideas about different ways that we could foster collaboration in the future.